to Craft, Design, Edit, Sleep, Repeat. I'm your host, Lisa Conway. Welcome to my world where we try to understand the business of knit and crochet design. Okay, welcome back, everybody. Today I'm thrilled to be talking with Gary Boston. He is another Aids Lifecycle writer that I have known for 2-3 years now?
Yep, a couple years, yeah.
Couple
Yeah.
years. And he just in the last 6 months or so has put his finger into the pot of designing. So I'm really excited to be working with him on that as well. So welcome, Gary.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Well, let's start off by telling people your knitting story. How long have you been knitting?
Sure.
How did you learn to knit?
I've been knitting for just under 20 years. So I grew up in a crafty family, so there were always sort of arts and crafts on the periphery. My grandmother was a knitter. My mom was a quilter, but we when we were kids, I think more than anything to keep us occupied when we would be visiting my grandma or whatever during the summer, she would have us, do arts and crafts. And so I got started. Probably the first thing I think was with her. We did macrame. Like, so this is back in the 70s. And although macrame seems to be having a renaissance right now, but we did wall hangings and the hanging pot holders and things like that. And then from there kind of moved into needlepoint on plastic canvas and counted cross stitch and things like that. And so I did all that when I was a kid. And then as I got older, that sort of fell to the wayside, and nothing really happened until I was well into adulthood. And I was trying to find something. My partner at the time was really into watching TV in the evenings, and especially watching like football games on the weekends. I was not. But I wanted to do that I could be in the same room and so we could spend time together, but that I was feeling like I was actually doing something productive and not just vegetating on the couch and watching television. And for whatever reason, a friend was visiting us who crocheted, and I was like, oh, maybe that's something I could try. Taught me the basic stitch. I made a square and decided that would work, and then started looking into things to crochet. And every time I would see something, I was like, oh, that looks great. It would be a knitting pattern. And so I said, well, the things that I seem to want to be gravitating towards making are knitting, so I should probably do this. So this is 2004, 2005, so before YouTube, before Ravelry. But I went to a local yarn store. I actually, most of when I learned was through books. I remember the Debbie Stoller Stitch and Bitch book, which was one of the ones I owned. And I think the Elizabeth Zimmerman Knitting Without Tears, or knitting, is that what it is? Knitting? I think it's called Knitting Without Tears.
Yeah, there's one Knitting Without Tears. There's
I can't. I remember Knitting Without Tears, Knitting in Plain English, and I can't remember who the author of
that's
that is.
Maggie Righetti.
Yes. So all of those sort of found their way to me, and I kind of learned the basics that way. My grandmother was still living, and I remember going home once, and she helped me out with some certain things. She taught me the backward loop cast on, because I think at that point probably I was still just knitting my cast on, and so she showed me that and gave me a bunch of her old supplies and stuff like that. So it was really books. I took a lesson at a local yarn store in New York City where I was living at the time, but that was it. I wish I had YouTube to to teach me. But.
Well, honey, mine goes way back further than that, let me tell you. And so far back that, what was I doing? I think it was weaving the yarn, the ends in at the end of a project, and my mother was like, "Well, don't you just do those as you go?" Because she taught me to knit it in
Oh,
right?
okay.
You
Uh-huh.
you connected the 2 and then you just knit it. But that's always bulkier, right?
Right.
And I said, "Well, um, techniques have come a long way since the '60s, mom."
Right. And I mean, it's true because I remember, um, an Afghan. I think my mom had been knitting when she was pregnant with my sister, and it was all done in these strips, and then they seamed each one together. And I was looking at something else, and they didn't have these like super long cable, circular needles that they could knit on, so everything was seamed up. And I was like, oh, thank goodness I learned when we had all these newer tools to work with.
Circular needles were fairly new about when I hit high school, so
Okay.
in the '70s. That's and they were really awful plastic cords.
Yep.
Yeah, yeah.
I remember I bought, and my sister still has them, and we always tease her about them. But I bought the first set of interchangeable needles I had were called Denise interchangeable needles, and they were these plastic tubes.
I still have a set.
And then you put the little tips into them. But yeah, yeah.
I wore those out. Those were actually available in the early '70s.
Okay, okay.
No, late '70s, early '80s,
Oh wow, okay.
because I had my first set of those. I was maybe 20 to 22-ish, somewhere in
Okay.
that region when I got my first, and boy, had a set,
Mm.
that was metal tips
Oh, okay.
that was more extensive than the Denise
Yeah.
needles, but they were very expensive,
Right.
right? Um, I think you can still buy the boy set.
Oh,
I
maybe.
know
Oh,
you
wow.
can still buy the Denise ones, but
Oh,
I'm
really?
pretty
Can
sure
you?
I've seen the boy set
Wow. Okay.
around still. But, yeah, needles have come a long way.
Yeah. Yeah, they definitely have. No, that was definitely a game changer when the I got the interchangeable needles, because most of what had learned on, um, I had one little clover bamboo set, but a lot of what I had in the very beginning were my grandma's old brushed aluminum, the multicolored ones,
Mhm.
straights, and that's how I did most of my knitting. So
Oh, I still have a whole bunch of those.
I've seen someone who makes really cool jewelry out of them. So they
Oh,
you can
yeah.
you can send them to them, and they cut them up and bend them, and turn them into really cool jewelry, which I think is a great reuse
Yeah,
of.
I've seen some really cool bracelets made out of
Mhm.
them and
Yep.
things like that, yeah. So what made you decide to dip your toe into designing? Tell me about that.
Well, it was very stumbled into it, more than decided. I'm sure we'll get into this. You mentioned the AIDS life cycle up front, but through some of the fundraising things that I do in the knitting community, I had gotten invited to speak on, Knit Stars, who I'm sure you're familiar with, has
Mhm,
their sort of new program is a subscription thing called the Yarniverse, and part of that program they have I think weekly Zoom calls with all of the Yarniverse members, and they have a program, and I think called Rising Stars, and they bring in different people to talk about different things. But somehow someone pitched me as someone to speak to the group about kind of what I do in the knitting world around the fundraising. And it was an interview very much like, like this. There's some fun and games, and that they do in the hour or so that we had. But one of the things was Shelly Brander, who's the CEO of Knit Stars, does sort of a little interview, and she asked, "Have you ever thought about designing?" And I said, "Oh, it's interesting you say that. This is going to be my final year doing the ride. I'm going to have a lot more free time on my hand, and it is something that I've thought about." Um, and from that, she was like, "Well, I've had this idea, and I'd love to figure out a way to tie it into your fundraising, but I have this idea for like a design competition where we take a professional designer and pair them up with someone who's just getting started in design, and put them on teams with each other, and they compete and come up with a design. And maybe there's some way we can turn this into a fundraiser for your bike ride. And so from that launched this Knit Stars Pro Am competition that started. It was this past fall, where they teamed me up with Louis Boria of Brooklyn Boy Knits. There was another team, Melinda Lesko and Nina Macklin Dayton, and we were all given the same yarn. I think part of the thing was that Knit Stars also had a large amount of yarn that they wanted to to utilize. But we had sort of unlimited quantity of this particular yarn, and that was the only real restriction, except for a time restriction that we had to come up with a design. So that it was probably a year faster than I had ever imagined that I would start to dip my toe into design. Um, but it was a really fun project, and it was one of those things that, when it comes across your plate, you can't say no, because when else are you going to have the opportunity to have like sort of a professional mentor on the design side to sort of help
Yes.
you through the very steep learning curve of like, how do you even write a pattern, and and things like that, and also to have it as sort of a fundraiser for what I was doing. So it was a great experience, but it was a little faster than I ever would have thought I would have gotten involved in design. So
And has it triggered the desire to do more? I mean, did it help support that idea and make it like, yeah, this is something I really do wanna do, or
it definitely sparked something. I did not even have. I mean, I had one teeny tiny little pocket-sized Stitch dictionary that I'd had for years and years, and I don't know that I had ever actually done anything with it. But as soon as we'd had this sort of first meeting where she's like, okay, you and Lewis want to work together, and we'll send you the yarn. Before I even had the yarn, I was down in my local library. I was like checking out every Stitch dictionary they had, and I had so much fun doing that process of it, of just sort of like, ooh, I like this stitch. And then I hadn't, before Lewis and I had even had our first meeting, like I had an idea of like what I wanted to do. It's not what we ended up with doing it at all, but we did use that one stitch that I had fallen in love with. And from there, just sort of like how to think about, okay, if we want to combine several different stitches, what do I need to think about in terms of the stitch multiples and how things are going to line up? And even though you have you know some really beautiful stitches, when you put them all together, it just looks like a hot mess. It doesn't look, it doesn't cohere in any sort of way. Um, and so that whole process of just the swatching and playing around with different stitches and tweaking them to kind of, take a stitch from this dictionary, but like, okay, we're going to make it shorter so that it, fits in the dimension we want. That whole thing, that whole part of the process was really, really fun. Um, and so that definitely sparked a something in me that I was like, ooh, I want to spend more time doing stuff like this. So, and this is, someone who um, only swatches because he knows it's the right thing to do when you're when you're doing something, not because there's any joy in my life from swatching. But this actually, I was like, "Ooh, this is actually fun," and I don't have to. It doesn't have to go anywhere. It doesn't really have to, end up anywhere. It can just be exploration for its own sake right now in the process. I mean, we did have a time constraint and we had to come up with a product, so there was a little bit. That was the less fun part of it, was the time crunch, but
well, as you get into designing and you start setting your own deadlines, though, you've had a good experience from knowing that you can't just take forever. If you
yeah,
want to produce, you're going to have to set yourself deadlines. So that
sure,
was a good first experience.
yeah,
I think that was my biggest problem is I released the first one and then never really set the goals and the timelines and the deadlines for myself to do more.
right, right.
So this year, that's been a big change for me because I've said, okay, I want to make sure I release at least 6 patterns.
Mm, mhm,
And I know that I'm going to do this sweater and I know I'm going to do this sweater, but what can I fill in with in between
right,
so that while those long test knits are going on and things like that, I'm still working on other stuff.
Yeah, just sort of
S
building that pipeline. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah,
Um, yeah, and it's a different way of thinking about it than I had in the past. So it's but yes, the playing with stitch patterns and techniques can
yeah.
be like because, okay, you've got this great stitch pattern, but your standard bind off doesn't really work with it,
Right, right.
right? So what bind off is gonna really work with this? What cast on is really gonna work with this? Those kinds of things, and just sitting and playing and figuring that out can be a lot of fun. And let me tell you, playing in charting software,
Ooh,
playing
okay.
in Stitch Mastery can be so fun. I
Hmm.
I can lose hours, hours.
Wow, I didn't even know. I didn't. I mean, I assumed that there was. And in fact, I think on one of your prior interviews, they talked. You had talked with the designer about the program, and I was like, ooh, wow, there are stitch pattern programs, which I had no idea. I didn't know anything about. So,
Listen to my, tech episode. I'd have to look up the number. I'll make sure I look up the number for you, and then my tech revisited from the beginning of this year,
okay, yeah,
because I talk about online
tools.
tools as well as the software and the benefits and the pros and
Oh,
cons of
great. Oh,
each.
perfect. Okay,
Um, so yeah, that will help. But Stitch
nice.
Mastery is the standard right now,
Okay,
and it's very, very, very well supported.
okay.
I've had 2 issues just in the last few months, and she has been incredibly my computer is I'm using my hands, people, and my computer just did confetti. Nobody can see that but me and
Yeah,
Gary, but
yeah.
yeah. Um, but she was incredibly supportive
Oh, cool. Oh,
and
that's great.
very, very responsive. So it's a worthwhile piece of software to invest in.
Yeah, I'm excited. I'm excited to start, playing around with things, and as I dig deeper into this thing, and
Yeah.
just kind of seeing what's out there. So
Yeah. Yeah. So you said that was tied into your fundraising.
yes,
How did you tie that into the fundraising? Go into that and start telling us a little bit more about your fundraising too.
sure. We could. I'll on the Niche Stars Pro Am. What we they decided to do was we put once we had come up with the designs, we put all of the both of the designs. So Lewis and I came up with a scarf pattern, and Nina and Melinda came up with a shawl pattern. So we didn't know what each other were working on until the very end, and they put them all together. And what they did is they put it all together into one pack, and then they sold that. And so 100% of those pattern sales for like a 6 week period went to my fundraising. And then Knit Stars was also incredibly generous, and 20% of the if you bought the yarn, that particular yarn that we had been using, they donated 20% of those proceeds over that same period of time to my fundraising for AIDS Lifecycle. So
Awesome.
yeah, so that was fun, and I they haven't announced yet how much we raised, but it was a really really nice donation. So it was really a great boost to my fundraising this year. They had reason they had wanted to that sort of I think Shelley had gotten attracted to the thing was as I said, this is going to be my last year, at least for a while, of doing the ride. When I started the ride back in 2019, I set a goal for myself to um, I don't know why it came into my head, but I said I'd had a longer history with these bike rides, which we can talk about it a little bit later. But I'd said, "Oh, I'd forgotten how much fun this was. I want to raise $200,000, and I'll give myself 10 years to do it." And luckily, it did not take 10 years because my legs are saying, that was probably a check your legs couldn't cash. But so this year looked like it was going to be the year that I hit my $200,000, and I basically from what I raised last year to what I needed to raise this year, there was about a $7,000, $8,000 gap. And so that was going to be a big chunk of bridging that gap. So it was a great help.
Lovely.
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll come back to your riding
Hmm.
and choosing not to ride anymore, but let's tell people more about AIDS Life Cycle. They heard
Sure.
some from Ellie last
Sure.
month, but now they're going to hear from you. Tell
Yeah.
us about AIDS Life Cycle and your connection to them.
Sure. So Aids Lifecycle is a 7 day, 545-mile bike ride from San Francisco to Los Angeles. That is the major fundraiser for both the San Francisco AIDS Foundation and the Los Angeles LGBT Center. So those two agencies are the beneficiaries for the ride. It's been going on for 30 years. Started back in 1994. Was at that point it was called the California Age Ride, and I got involved in 2019. A good friend of mine had joined the board of San Francisco AIDS Foundation. Back Backtrack to 1996 or so, California AIDS Ride had started in 94. The next year, there was a ride from Boston to New York that was started called the Boston to New York, excuse me, AIDS Ride. In 1996, 97, I did that ride. I was living in New York at the time. A woman I worked with was like, it was like the third year that they'd done the ride, I think. And she said, I saw them riding down 6th Avenue this last year. Was that something you'd ever want to do? And I said, yes. So we did that ride. I ended up doing the Boston, New York ride 3 times as a rider, once as a roadie. I did 2 rides across Texas. And then in 1999, I did the Alaska AIDS vaccine ride, which was the last ride I did. It was a brutal week of riding. With The weather was not at all cooperative. It sleeted, it snowed, it rained almost every single day.
What
It was
month did you guys do that
I
in?
think they pushed. I think it was either end of August or early September. I think they wanted to push it, like they. It was the first year they did it. They did ended up doing it twice, and it was the first year they did it, and they tried to figure out a time where the weather was supposed to be like the best chance of good weather. Um, and there was just this freak snowstorm day two that left a. I mean, I think there were probably like 700 riders or so on that ride. It was a relatively small ride, but like half of them got stuck at like this at a pit stop. They had to call in like either like the state guard or the national guard with like trucks to like bus a bunch of people into to camp. I rode on it into to camp, but we were just unprepared. Like, we'd all brought rain gear and things like that, but not like sleeting snow gear. And so we had like mylar blankets like wrapped around our feet and like stuck shoved in our shoes.
Okay, the
Yeah.
only month you could attempt anything like that is the end of June through the middle of July.
I don't think it was. I think it was later
I
than that.
Anyone doing it any other time of year was not thinking Alaska weather.
Right. I think the next year, I think it was beautiful. The next year, whenever maybe they moved it up, but that ride did it for me. Came home. This was in 1999. Came home, put my bike in the storage bin. I was living in New York at the time. Put it in the storage bin and did not touch that bike for 20 years,
Oh,
until I
wow.
until I moved out here. And that's when my girlfriend, who was on had joined the board, she was like, "Oh, all the board members." She wasn't a cyclist. She's like, "All the board members do the ride once." And she's like, "So I feel like I have to do it. I remember you used to do these rides back in the day. Would you be interested in doing it?" I was like, I moved out to California, had a lot more free time, and I was like, yeah, I'll do that with you. And then after that first year, I forgot how much I had enjoyed both the training and the fundraising aspect, and that's where I got this wild idea. I was like, oh, I'll do it 10 more times and raise $200,000. So that's kind of how my history with the ride has happened. And so this will be my sixth year of doing it out here, and it's been amazing. I mean, it's a really really fantastic event. The We call it the love bubble, the 7 days that we spend on the road together. Just you have there's 2,500 to 3,000 riders and probably another 750 to 1,000 crew members, and it's just this wonderful community where everybody, it's a hard event. It's like everyone's working really hard. The hours are long, but everyone's just sole goal is to like get ourselves down the coast from San Francisco to LA safely. And so there's just a lot of like kindness and love and things that you don't, necessarily experience in your everyday life at that scale. So
Right.
it's a fantastic event, and raises a lot of money. I think that it's been a struggle the last couple of years post COVID. I think to raise as much money as we did I think the peak year was the year right before COVID, where they raised like $17 million that year, and so I think it's been down a bit since then. But it still raises a substantial amount of money each year for the two organizations. So
You were talking about the scale, and for some reason, it never dawned on me that that many people would be participating in riding in that kind of an event,
yeah,
and that's huge.
it's massive. It's like this little city that, and the logistics involved are mind blowing. I mean, they've been doing it for 30 years, so they've got it pretty well down to like a fine oiled machine. The route has stayed this roughly the same. There's always some traffic issues that you need to work around, but the stops at night are in the same places, and so they've kind of got it down. But it's a fleet of, you know 20 probably Penske trucks that are just for the tents and our gear. There's doctors, masseuses, acupuncturists, physical therapists, bike mechanics. It's a big operation, and it's really really impressive that they're able to pull it all off every year with, because you have to deal with. Luckily in California, the weather's not like it is, not as unpredictable as it is in Alaska. But last year we had, it was the coldest ride that I've had to do, and we had one day where it was just brutal rain, and again, people weren't necessarily prepared for it, and so they have to be, they have a fleet of like Greyhound type buses where, they can go and pick up people at pit stops if they need to, and get them into camp, get them into camp every night. But it's a huge undertaking, but it's also just amazing to see, because it's just this, you know, mass of cyclists like all riding together.
Yeah.
And when we do all stop, there's, a couple places along the route where there's a fried artichoke stand in the middle of the Central Valley of California, where everybody stops to get fried artichokes. And there's like, all of a sudden there's just like this sea of like, the sea of cyclists like stopped on the side of the road eating fried artichokes. So it's a pretty impressive sight. It is.
Oh, yeah, I can imagine it just the picture of it in my head of that many people going down the road on bicycles. It
Yeah.
just
Well,
is amazing.
and
Sounds
and I don't know,
amazing.
if Ellie told you about Red Dress Day, but on the fifth day of the ride, everybody dresses in red dresses or red costumes of some sort, and so it's just this, you know, sea of red winding up, and we go through like Vandenberg Air Force Base, or Space Force Base now, but Vandenberg Air Force Base, and they, at this point they know what's happening, but anyone who is out on the road on that day and has not seen it before must be thinking, "What is going on? It's not Halloween." You know. So,
That would be a sight to see.
yeah,
That would
yeah,
definitely be a sight to see. Um, I know that a lot of your fundraising has been around the knit along.
yeah.
Will you be continuing that after you stop writing? And
I think in some form or another, I will do some of that. So the knit-alongs started after my second or third ride. Um, I'd sort of done the whole like raising money through friends and family, and I was like, okay, they're going to start to get a little tired every year of me hitting them up for money. And I'd gotten much more involved in knitting, and my knitting had sort of taken off, and I was, um, meeting designers and meeting dyers and things like that. And I was like, there's got to be a way to combine these two things that I love. And I just had this idea. I was like, people like these like knit-alongs. Why couldn't we do a knit-along as a fundraiser? And my idea was just to do one. And then I put out a thing on Instagram, basically like, here's a crazy idea. Would any designer be interested in like doing a pattern for a knit along as a fundraiser? It got picked up by a couple of people who, shared it, and like overnight I had 20 or 30 designers raise their hand and said, "Oh yeah, I'd happily give you a pattern to da, 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 da." Through that process, one of the ones, a woman that I had reached out, Evan Bale O'Keefe, and she's in Ireland. She's American but living in Ireland, and she said, "You're thinking too small. You don't do just one of these. Do like a whole series of them." And part of the growth in the fundraising in the knitting community has just me not being wise enough to say no ever to anything. And so I was like, sure, let's do four of them. We'll do it every quarter. And then someone was like, well, why don't you add a crochet along? And I was like, sure, let's do crochet. So that's how it got started. It was just going to be one. And then we decided to do four of them a year. And so that's been going on this is the third season of doing sort of four knit alongs and crochet alongs. And sometimes we add a sock in there because a sock designer says, oh, I have this new sock pattern. Do you want to use it? And I'm like, sure, let's add socks. And so we pair a designer up with a dyer usually, and we sell yarn kits. And it's been very important for me to make it work in whatever way works best for their business. So if it's an existing design that they already have um, established pricing on and they don't want to mess around with that, I never want the fundraising piece of it to come out of the dyer's pocket. I want it to come out of the participant's pocket. So we'll just charge an entry fee. So we do an entry ticket, and then you buy the pattern separately. Sometimes it's a new pattern, and the designer will say, yeah, I'll tack on $3 or $4 to that pattern price for X period of time, and that'll be the donation to the ride. Similarly with the dyers, it's a little easier, I think, on that end to say, like, we'll just add $1 to a skein, and that'll be the donation. I've never had anyone not get it in terms of the ultimate consumer saying, like, I get this is a fundraiser, and yes, yarn,
Right.
which is normally $30, is going to be $32 because two of that's going to go to you. So it's just kind of been, it's a little different each time, but it's been a ton of fun. It's built we have a really great community of people who participate, and it's allowed me to meet a ton of designers and work with them and dyers as well. So that's been a really fun thing. But I do think I will not do four of them a year. In addition to this year feeling like my body doesn't want to do the bike riding anymore, part of me is like, I want to knit on something that's not a knit along, that, I want to knit something
Right.
for my, just do some of my own knitting. But I do think that doing a couple of them a year, I would like to continue to support Aids Lifecycle, even if I'm not a rider. So maybe we'll do one in the spring heading into the bike ride, and raise a little money for that. They just started, which I think is a brilliant idea. The Aids Lifecycle this year started kind of like a scholarship fund, and it's for first time riders. So all riders have to raise a minimum of $3,500 to participate. But when it's your first year doing it, that can seem
That
like
can
a
be
lot of,
tough.
it can be a tough. I remember my first ride back in '90s. This was before everything was done online, but we would show up to the first day, day zero of the ride, for orientation, and you had a pile of checks, and people would be at the check-in line, sort of bartering, like, okay, like, I'm $100 short. Well, I'm like, well, here, you could take one of my $100 donations, and sort of like working it out that way. And so the ride this year started this sort of scholarship fund. So I think that would be a cool thing to do, is to do a fundraiser and have that just all go to the scholarship fund. So I'll continue to do that, and a couple of other organizations that I've gotten involved in. Knit the Rainbow, which is they collect garments for homeless LGBTQ youth in several cities, and kind of in the East Coast mainly. But to do a fundraiser for them or something like that, I think would be a fun thing to do. But I am looking forward to not doing one every single. It seems like right now, as soon as one's over, I'm like launching the next one, and I have
Yes.
not had a lot of time to knit for myself. So
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, I agree that
Yeah.
4 a year is a lot.
Yeah, yeah, it
It's a
is.
lot, but it helped you reach your goal.
It did help me reach my goal. It was real. It was. Um. It. I mean, it's been interesting. It's sort of a stepping stone to a couple other fundraisers in the knitting community. So I kind of from that launched this sort of yarn garage sale that I call D-Stash for Good, which is like a way for people to sell off their stash through me, and we split the profits, and that goes to the fundraising. And because I've met a bunch of dyers, it's going to be it'll all be done by the time we get this out. But I've just put together a yarn collection inspired by the sights and sounds of AIDS Lifecycle, that I have like 21 dyers who have used inspiration photos and dyed up some yarn. So it's been a great gateway to a lot of other things.
Well, and that part of it can still go on and you can still knit for yourself because you can be knitting with colors you love
Yeah,
and
yeah,
doing any pattern
yeah,
you
and
want and
yeah, and I mean it's a thing. I think when now that I've achieved sort of the fundraising goal, it'll just be a lot more. Again, it's one of these things that like
relaxed.
there won't be a deadline, and if I'm like I want to I want to knit this sweater. Let's do that into a make along. Maybe other people want to make it as well. And I was just actually over the weekend chatting with a meta designer at an event, and I was like, oh, I'd love to be able to do something together. And I after I got home, I just texted him and I said, you know, it doesn't have to be a fundraiser. Like I enjoy running the knit alongs, and I'm not sure that every designer loves to run a knit along for their own designs. I said, so if there's a designer out there that has a new pattern and they want to get some momentum behind it and want to run a knit along, like I'd be happy to just run it for them and just we'll do zooms and we'll do.
We may have to talk.
Okay, yeah, yeah, yeah. Because
And in the process, you can learn some really fun new techniques
that's true. I mean that's the other
because
has been the great thing about this.
a lot of my designing is not the sweater, I admit, is fairly simple, but that was on purpose. Um, but a lot of what I've been doing has been utilizing newer techniques.
Mm.
I've released 2 cowls based on the same idea that were a double knit panel with double knitted brioche,
Ooh,
which is not the same as standard brioche, people. It does create a different fabric,
ooh,
but it's all done in one pass.
oh, okay,
So it's not the whole having to slide things back and
right,
knit
right,
a
right.
second time. So I just yesterday cast on for a new design in triple knitting.
I'm sorry, I had a mouthful, but I've never even heard of this.
Um, we need to talk about Thursdays. But yeah, so I've been having fun in my design work of playing with new things.
Hmm.
Not necessarily things I've come up with, but things that friends have come up with, techniques and things that I'm incorporating
Yeah,
into my work. So
yeah.
yeah,
That's been um a real benefit of doing these knit alongs, because I never said, I never know what the designers are going to do, and I'm open to just about anything. And so through this, I've done my first stranded colorwork project. I've done my, I can't remember other things, but there's been several new techniques where it's been the first time I've ever done socks. I knit my first pair of socks through one of these knit alongs, and so it's been a great sort of technique pusher for me. And I think
yeah.
I think that's one of the fun things about knit alongs is you can pick up some new things, and you've got then usually community people who are all doing it at the same time, and you can share tips and techniques, tips and tricks
Yep.
and things like that. So
Tips, tricks, techniques, ideas. Gee, this works better for me this way. That works
right.
better for you that way. Yeah, yeah. That's what I like about a knit along. I don't like mystery knit alongs where I don't know what I'm going to make.
Mm-hmm.
I did 1 or 2 of them, and I realized that they just didn't work for me because I wanted to know what I was gonna get at the end of it,
Right.
and I
Right.
didn't wanna just know, "Okay, this is gonna be a shawl," or whatever. I wanted to see it
Right.
so I could plan it better,
Right.
but yeah. So, I know that it's too late for people probably to join to ride this year's.
I don't know when they cut off the ride. I mean, it would probably be tough for you to raise your money in a
Y
month and a half to unless
yeah,
you just were sitting
yeah,
on a something. Um, but the as soon as the ride is over, they will open up. So the ride happens the first week of June. So in fact, starting during the ride, you can probably sign up for next year's ride if you were interested in doing that, either as a rider, or they're also um, sign up to be a roadie, which is another way to, if you're not into the riding. I won't say that it's an easier week for you, because that is a lot of those jobs are really physical, and the hours can be tough, because if you're a pit stop team that is one of the morning pit stops, that means you're probably getting up at like 3 in the morning to get out on the road and go set up your pit stop. So
right, exactly.
yeah.
But there's support staff and things like that that maybe they could still even a month and a half before the ride could probably still use people, or are
Oh
they
yeah, I
pretty
think so.
set?
I think so. If you had the flexibility to want to, be on the ride itself, you could probably still sign up to become a roadie, and they would just kind of put you where it needs you. And then always, if you're in the Bay Area at the front end of the ride, the day of like check-in and stuff, they always need a ton of volunteers to like help check people in, and things like that. Or likewise at the end of the ride, if you're in the Los Angeles area for the finish line cruise, there's they always need volunteers there to like direct people to where their bags are, and things like that. So I think there's still plenty of opportunities to chip in if it's something that
Cool.
interests you. Yeah.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
So, this is your last year. We've talked a little bit about what's coming, but do you have any plans for, like, immediately after the ride? What's new? What's happening? What's gonna happen this summer
This um
other than maybe mothballing the mice bicycle for a little while?
Yeah, well, I think I'll still try to get out, occasionally. On the where we live, the weather's always so pleasant that it is an easy way to get some exercise, and it's a really pretty area to ride around in. I think that in the fall, um, I think there's going to be some design stuff. I have so I we did this Lewis and I did the scarf for the Knit Stars Pro Am thing, and as part of that, just because we weren't sure how they were going to do the yarn, and we thought we had an extra skein of yarn, I came up with a hat that matched the scarf, and so
Mhm.
I put that out. I already have a couple ideas for another hat. I'm going to be taking this spring. I don't know how I'm going to fit it in, but I'm signed up for it. So I'm taking a hat design class this spring. So I'm hoping that I can take what I've learned there, and like maybe in the fall, um, do a couple more kind of hat type designs. And I want to do a because the yarn that we designed the scarf in is no longer in existence. So Knit Stars got out of the yarn business, and so they sold off on that yarn. And so what I would like to do is go back and revisit the scarf and the existing scarf and hat in like a more available yarn, and kind of put that back out as that. So there's gonna be some of that, but I'm really looking forward to this fall, this summer and this fall, just getting back into like knitting that's something that's not deadline knitting, and
Right.
just I'm not going to any of the like Rhinebeck or any of that stuff this year. So I don't have. I'll probably do some of the West Coast yarn, the yarn event, but I'm really looking forward to just like being able to like work on projects that are for me. I'd like to do another sweater, and just kind of take that time to just do some fun knitting for myself. So
That sounds like a good plan, a really good plan.
Yeah.
With everything you've learned through Lewis and through the Knit Stars and these first couple of patterns,
Mm.
what advice would you give for someone who's thinking about getting started in designing?
Well, if you can do it with a mentor who is has years of design under about that's a good place to start. But I would say for me, the two the two things that that I walked away from and that I have continued to think about. One is to write everything down, to like as you're going through, like just take even what you don't think even matters, just as you're swatching with different stitches, just keep a note on like every single thing you did, if you changed anything, why you were doing something the way that you were doing it. Um because when you get to when you get to to the end and you're actually to the point where you're writing the pattern down, it's really, I found it really helpful to go back and have those details, and like, why did we decide to do this thing this way. I mean, the other thing that came out of that process is think about the end before you think about the beginning. Because we had all these like great ideas about like how we wanted to do this scarf, and we had this infinity scarf was one of the versions of it. And it was just one of those things we said like, oh, we'll just knit it in a loop, and then we'll just like graft it together or whatever. But like, I had never grafted anything in pattern. I just had in my mind like, oh, it'll be just like the Kitchener stitch, or it'll be something. Well, it's not. Grafting in a 2x2 rib is not the same as a Kitchener stitch, and I hadn't even thought about how the thing was going to end. And then had gotten through the whole process of writing the whole thing up, and then finally got there, and then I was like, oh, now what? Now I had to like go down a rabbit hole. So that would be my other bit of advice, is like, think about the ending before you get started. And kind of maybe work backwards a little bit as well as working forwards.
I coulda used a little bit of that advice about a month ago because I, ripped out the collar se the yoke section of my sweater 5 times
Ooh.
trying to get it right because what I envisioned the neckline to be couldn't be done in the techniques I wanted to use.
Oh, yeah, I almost threw the
And it
towel in
took
on
me
this.
twice just to figure out why it wasn't gonna work.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and that's the other thing, is, I mean, that was the uncomfortable part of being under a deadline, is because I said, well, if I had all the
Mhm.
time in the world, I would be able to sit down and sort of figure out the sort of philosophy of grafting, and how to think about it. But I was like, I just need it done. Like, I just need like the answer, and I just need to find a way to make this thing work. And I mean, that's a whole nother show. But so that those two things. And then the other thing I would say that I will never not do, I mean, we couldn't, is I will always have test knitters. um that that because of the nature of the thing, we couldn't do it. And already, there's been, the thing that like I didn't want to happen is like someone was like found an error or found a confusion or something in the pattern that was, seemed perfectly clear to me, but when they saw it, they saw something completely different. And I think if we had test knitters do it, that would have saved me having to go back and fix things after it was done.
Don't ever release anything without both a tech editor
Yeah,
and a test knitter.
yeah.
It just yeah, I get that. Um, y you have to have both because I will tell you as a tech editor, the way I look at things is completely different from how the tester does,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right? I'm looking for the technical. I'm
Sure.
looking for commas and periods, and yes, I am looking that it reads clearly, but I'm not doing it, and it's when you do it
Right.
that some of those little things come to light.
Yep. No, absolutely. And it was just, and some of them were. the most efficient way of saying something is not always the clearest way of saying something
Yeah.
in terms of the line by line instructions. And so some of those little things, it doesn't change the pattern, but if there's a way to make it a little easier for folks to read. So that was the other big takeaway, was like, I really wish we had been able to test net. So on the next one, there will definitely be a test net, as well as tech. I knew the tech editing, because I'd been down that path before, but I didn't really. I mean, I figured by the time it got that far that there weren't going to be any major errors, but it wasn't major stuff. It was like little
No, it's the little stuff that
nitpicky
the
stuff. Yeah,
testers it's
yeah.
the little stuff that testers bring up that you didn't even think of. Yeah, it's an amazing thing how different we look at those 2 things.
Hmm.
Those when you're a tech editor versus a tester, how you look at the pattern is completely different, and the things you catch are completely different.
Right.
Yeah, I get it. I tell people all the time, you can't do it with just one. You have to have
Mhm.
both.
Yeah. Yeah. No,
And you
I
can't skip either one because both will see different things,
right. Right.
right?
Yeah.
It just, you know, uh, yeah, yeah. Don't ever do it. But I
No
like
short
your
there are no
think about the
shortcuts.
end before you get. And really and truly, I had thought about the end. It was just that I hadn't thought about why what I wanted to do wouldn't work the way I wanted to do it.
Right. Right. And then that's one of those things that, like, you don't oftentimes you don't know until you're actually doing the thing. Like, it's
Right.
things that, like, seem perfectly clear, on paper or in theory. It's not until you're, like, needles and yarn in hand and you're down to the nitty gritty doing it, you're like, oh, yep, that's not going to work that way.
Which testers are critical for that very reason.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Definitely.
last but not least, Gary, where can our people find you and where can they find the patterns?
So patterns the hat pattern is up on Ravelry. What I have not done, and I don't know if it's going to get done before the ride, but the hat pattern is up on Ravelry. So it's called the Smock It To Me hat. And it is, I'm on Ravelry. I'm Gary Knits and Rides. um,
Okay.
and so it's up there, and I hopefully I will get the scarf pattern, which is called Make the Turn Scarf, um, up there. It was in the pack from Knit Stars, exclusive until the end of our little make along, and now I just need to break that out and fix one little thing that someone was not a test knitter, but is a someone who effectively became a test knitter because they found a little rewording that they wanted that
Right.
made more sense. And I would like to try to get that. And I looked at it last night. It's really quick to do, so I should be able just to do that and get that up on Ravelry. You can otherwise you can find me on Instagram. I'm Gary Knits and Rides. Oh no, Gary Knits Gary Rides with underscores around. And then I also have a YouTube channel called Gary Knits Gary Rides, which is typical knitting YouTube, where I'm talking about what I'm working on, but each episode I try to find things in the knitting community where people are doing fundraisers or charity work, or what I broadly call craftivism, which makes it sound more political than it really is. But just people who are, whether it's a dyer that has a special colorway that they're donating proceeds to something, or someone that's collecting hats for a hospital somewhere. And I try to put those out there and let folks know of things that I've found in the community of people doing things like
I'll have to check that out. I didn't
that.
know you were a YouTuber.
Yeah. It's a little over a year. It's every couple of weeks. It's still pretty small, but I have fun doing it. So that's the main point. So
All right. Well, that's great. Gary, I want to just remind our listeners that Gary has been very, very big in teaching me about AIDS Lifecycle, and so I've talked with Ellie now and Gary about this really fabulous charity. They do a lot of really great work. So if you are in any way, shape, or form able to provide services as a volunteer or funds to support a rider. Maybe if you don't know a rider, you can just donate to the scholarship fund yourself. Please do that, because this really is a good charity worth supporting, and they've done a lot of really great work in the past, and they need your support to continue to do that. So,
Absolutely.
Gary, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, I
I
think this is a lot
it's
of fun. Thanks for having me. And
this has been a blast as
yeah,
usual. So,
yeah.
catch you next time.
Okay, bye.
Join me next time when I discuss some of the frustrations I hear from designers and possible solutions. Don't forget to like and subscribe wherever you listen, and join the conversation in our Ravelry or Facebook groups. For show notes or knit tech editing and related services, please visit my website at arcticedits.com.